So thank you so much for having us up here. We're thrilled to be at Leeds. I was pleased at the initial introduction because it talked about how we do our work, right? How we go about and try to find new things. Do I need to go stand over here the whole time so that you guys see you're changing the camera?
You're good.
Good?
You're
Okay, because I don't do that well. All right, so you're just going to be disappointed. So one of the things that I want to talk about today a little bit is how we build a program research, and how we ask a question that leads to another question that leads to another question, and how we progress through that to be able to get a broader understanding of what's going on. But first, I want to address the first question. So I'm at the University of Texas, and so I know you assumed I would look like this when I showed up. I'm at the University of Texas, but I'm from Philadelphia. And I actually own 2 cowboy hats, 2 pairs of cowboy boots, and I'm like eyeing a third pair because I need like the nice dress black cowboy boots that I can wear with a suit. And if that doesn't tell you the importance of place, I don't know what does, right? And a lot of what we're talking about is the importance of place and where individuals are and what happens with that, because that drives a host of behaviors. Because if I stayed in Philadelphia, I would never own a cowboy hat. I would think they were silly and a waste. And my gosh, I have these awesome pair of ostrich cowboy boots that are, I should not spend that much. I thought that was a ridiculous purchase when I was in Philadelphia. But because where I live now, it has changed my behaviors and changed how I think about things. And this is important because we know quite clearly that we have evolved to be physically active in animals, right? And that's what happens. And the reason for that is that physical activity was a necessity. It was not something that you had choice over. It was something that you had to do. And it's really only recently that we have become that. So, how many people have been in a zoo in the last couple of years? Have you had that experience being in a zoo? So zoos, on one hand, are awesome, right? Because you get to see these really cool animals that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. What is the other feeling you sometimes get at the zoo?
Depression.
Due to depression, why?
Because you see lots of animals caged and looking really sad.
Right, and not just looking really sad, but because they always look kind of happy to me, but they're still caged and they're not in their normal environment. They don't have the normal area with which to move and to do the things they would normally do. Well, what am I looking at right now? Is a bunch of animals in the zoo. And that is how our environments are structured now. We have taken away the necessity for physical activity. And most individuals are going to work in jobs where they're seated at a computer for the vast majority of their day. That is not how we have evolved to live. When was the last time anybody had to walk more than 1 flight of stairs? It's very rare, right? There's escalators, there's elevators that you can take. That level of physical activity used to be a part of every day. Most jobs, that was a part of what happened. That's no longer the case. So for the first time in human history, we have to invent opportunities to be physically active. And this idea of place and health in place is really important. And so this is average life expectancy at different parts of New Orleans. And what you can see is that in some areas near the French Quarter, the life expectancy is 55 years. But if you move a few miles away from that, it's 80 years. Where you live matters. And we can look at that and say, New Orleans, yeah, I can understand that in New Orleans, right? Maybe you look at that and you think, New Orleans is a tough town. You can see where that would happen. But this is Minneapolis. And we see the same thing. It's not as dramatic. But you can see from 75 to 79 years, 70 to 75 years, to 83 years. Huge life expectancy differences based only upon where you live. And that is the impact that place has. And so when we start to think about how we structure the classrooms, how we structure environments, that structure is going to drive the behaviors that individuals engage in. And so this is an idea that comes from Leslie Lytle, where she talks about restricted environments, and she's more interested in nutrition and talks about food islands and these ideas that there are large areas where you don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, right? Where it's difficult to be able to find those. You have to travel a long distance to be able to make that happen. And so you have these restricted environments where everything is based on, yeah, how about that? All right, we're here, All right, where here on the left-hand side of this graph, everything is driven by the environment. And so her argument was, we need to get here where the environment is no longer restricted to allow social and individual factors to drive behavior. Well, we're actually talking about the opposite effect. We're talking about a situation now where we want to move children from an environment where it's all about choice to one in which the school is dictating that behavior in some respects and starting to reduce those choices. So this happens, and you see this everywhere. So on our campus, we now have a policy that every new building that is built, the stairs have to be in front. When you walk in the building, the stairs are open, they're inviting, they're very easy to find. The elevator is tucked away in the corner. There is an elevator because there are people that have to use an elevator, but it's not up front. It's not as opposed to older constructions where the elevator was up front and the stairs were tucked away behind the fire door. Not very inviting, right? How do we shift those environments to be able to make that choice the natural choice and make that something that's more likely to occur? And so this is an example of choice architecture where you change the architecture to be able to drive the physical activity. Nudge is the famous book that talks about this. It's also been talked about as libertarian paternalism, right? And so paternalism is where we narrow options for individuals and make decisions about those, but we still provide choice as a part of that, which is the libertarian component to it. And so this is sort of a general perspective and sort of philosophy underlying kind of how I think about things. So why study schools as a way to go? Well, one, it's a fabulous way to think about environments and policy and how they interact to be able to drive things, so that works well. Moderate and vigorous physical activity we know declines with age and carries forward into when children are older, when we become adults, and so it becomes an important public health outcome. And it turns out there are like kids everywhere. Do you know what I mean? Like if you want to study children, it's like they force them to go there or something. I mean, they are everywhere. You can't turn a corner in a school without finding one little kid. So it's really handy from that perspective if you want to understand what children are doing. Now, this is an example of one of the schools that we study. It's Live Oak Elementary School. So you can see the school up in the right-hand corner. This has a large track because there's a secondary school that is on the same property that is adjacent to that. They normally wouldn't have that. But this sort of idea of an open field adjacent to our schools is really quite common. About 530, this is kinder, so 5-year-olds through 5th grade that we look at for this, so 5 through 11-year-olds. 532 students, about 40% are low socioeconomic status, so they get free and reduced lunch provided for them as our indicator for that. You can see it's a reasonably mixed group, pretty good academic standards. We used 4th grade classrooms, and we did 5 days of accelerometry. Now, we did this in 30 schools, but we're 28. We're just going to talk about this one school to give you an idea of the data that we collect and what happens with it. And so we focused on physically active learning that you're all familiar with. The question is, why do we do this? There's a lot of things we could do to increase physical activity in schools. Why are we focused on physical activity learning? Why do we see this as the place where we should be spending our time and thinking about it? So these are accelerometry data for the school. And so looking at these, which one do you think is in-class activity, physically active learning? Out of those. A couple of things that are interesting. This is the regular classroom period. C relatively low, right? So out of these bumps, which one do you think is in-class activity? Right? You got a vote? That's what we see. Recess, physical education, and then in-class physically active learning. So let me break those down a little bit for you. Recess is interesting. A lot of people talk about expanding recess as a way to increase moderate and vigorous physical activity. Problem with that perspective is that schools are so highly regulated, okay? You have to ask permission to go to the bathroom. When was the last time you had to ask permission if you could go to the bathroom, right? Like that's just, or get out of your desk, or to do anything. It's so tightly controlled. And even lunch periods can be tightly controlled in the US in terms of where you can sit, who you can talk to, what happens with that, especially at primary grades. So the only time you get to talk to anybody you want to is when you're at recess. And there's a lot of talking going on and not a lot of running, okay? That's what we tend to see happening at recess. Is there a group of kids that are highly active, that are playing football, that are playing basketball, what have you? Yes, there is, but it's a relatively small number. The vast majority of the kids are walking around and talking to one another, and so these are the data for girls and these are the data for boys. And we show the same relationships and both same patterns of effects. So you can expand recess, but you're not going to get a lot of moderate and vigorous physical activity. You can force them to be active by having teachers come out and organize runs and things along those lines, but then you're sacrificing what is really important social time for them and that opportunity to be able to do things. And so we've moved away from that. This also shows that just providing an area to be active is insufficient to get people active. Right? We have to do more than that to be able to move that forward. So we think about physical education, and physical education is the best, right? It gets a hard reputation in the US because less than 50% of the time is spent in moderate and vigorous physical activity. But my argument is that that's not what is supposed to happen. So here are data for girls, and this line is the moderate and vigorous physical activity that we're looking for. Okay? So that's our data for girls, and that's our data for boys from this school. And what you find is, I think this reflects really nice physical education. You have an initial period of warm-up that they do, and then you have a period of teaching where they're working on sports skills and developing those sports skills, and then they're implementing them for the last 15 to 20 minutes of class, right? And so those patterns of expectation should be there. Can we drive physical activity above that, where they're just in and it becomes a fitness class, and they're running back and forth for 45 minutes? Yes, we can do that. But part of the benefit of physical education is teaching sports skills that they can carry with them for a lifetime, where they can learn different skills, that they can go in and be active in high school or as adults and join adult leagues, rec leagues, and what have you. And so, so we haven't targeted that. We've instead targeted physical active learning. What we like about it is it takes the time when the children are most sedentary and replaces that with a time in which they're physically active. So this is the data that we get for girls. And you can see very nice peaks up, high variability with regards to this, but nice peaks up over that, nice levels of activity. And then for boys, not as much variability, but still you can see we get a reasonable amount of physical activity during those periods. The evolution of our program. We started out, so my wife's a teacher. And I hated all the early stuff that came out. Take 10 and some of the early things because they were designed to do physical activity next to your desk in no other space and to do a simple enough content that you could do it regardless of how old you are. And so there's a lot of acting out things. It wasn't pedagogically challenging. I'm starting to understand why they made those decisions. But early on, so what we focused on was embodied learning, and we have some fabulous lessons, right? I mean, we spent 2 years creating an entire curriculum with all different teachers and what have you to make this go. And so we have a lesson for 6-year-olds on planetary, on the solar system, right? Where they start out walking in a circle so that they can understand how planets rotate, how they circle the Earth, and then we have them turn in circles as they're walking around, right? I mean, it's a high level of activity that really teaches the skill for them. And we have a host of lessons like this that we do with the kids. And our idea behind that was if you want to feed somebody, give them a fish. You want to feed them for a lifetime, teach them how to fish. So we want to teach teachers how to fish. And the feedback we got from teachers is, you know what, we really just want the damn fish, right? I mean, we have a lot to do. This is a hard job, and we can't just figure this out. Can you make this a little bit easier for us to be able to make this happen? And so we've totally changed our approach. And what we do is we focus on very simple games that we teach. Freeze tag is one of the best learning games you can play. So we do freeze tag. Kids are taggers and they get frozen and put their hand up. When your hand's up, a kid comes up with an index card and asks you a question. If you get it right, your hand goes back down and you get to run again. Okay? High levels of activity. You can do any information you want. You can do math facts. You can do state. You can do capitals, geography, history, anything you want to that teachers can write up index cards really quick and the game's planned. Once you teach them how to do it, they know how to do it. It's quick and easy to turn over and make happen, and teachers love it. Kids love it. The other thing that happens that teachers, I love this study. It's just this really nice, clean way to get at the question. So what we do is we do a traditional spelling lesson where they're seated. We do a seated spelling relay where they pass a piece of paper around the table and each kid adds a letter and the first team done wins, right? And then we do a walking back and forth spelling relay and a running back and forth spelling relay where each child adds a letter, right? And this allows us to make a nice clean comparison between seated, light activity, moderate to vigorous activity, and what impact this has on their attentional focus. And then we come back in and we measure time on task again. Yes? Any questions about that? Does that make sense? All right. So these are the accelerometer counts, and basically what it shows is that our control lessons are primarily sedentary, our light activity is primarily light, and our high intensity activity is predominantly moderate and vigorous, so we achieve the conditions that we want to ask the questions. So this is the reduction in time on task that we see with a sedentary lesson. At the pretest, 70% of the time children are focused on what the teacher is asking them to do. At the end of the regular lesson, it drops down to about 55% of time they're spent there. That's very common. You show it. It's easy to demonstrate that as an effect. We see it all the time. If you have them do an enjoyable game, if they're passing the piece of paper around and they're racing against one another to be able to do that, you eliminate that reduction. So they're able to maintain their attentional focus while they're performing. Okay? If they're doing it while walking back and forth, they improve their attentional focus, and then that's the data we get if they're running. This is the unfortunateness of randomization, that we got a bunch of people that were really either poor teachers or they weren't focused, whatever it was there. But you can quite clearly see that there's something unique about physical activity that is driving this benefit. It's not just about enjoyable learning for the children. It is something about physical activity and the fact that they have to be moving to be able to derive these benefits. I think that's a really critical component that comes out of this study. Okay? There's a benefit to an enjoyable activity, but the real increase comes following physical activity. But what about the intensity? From that study we couldn't tell, because we had this problem where the highly active group had more of an improvement, but they started a lot lower to begin with. And they improved to about the same level, right? So is intensity important? Intensity is something that matters. And so we just published this paper to be able to get at that issue, to be able to get at that. We did a large trial of schools, 2,000 kids, huge. I mean, we did direct observations of time on task on 2,000 kids in this study. And for those of you who are in your advanced statistical modeling class, I'll leave that up because I don't really understand this. This is why I work with people that understand these things. And you can too, so don't worry about that. So, this is what we get. So the orange bar is treatment, right? And what it shows is that if you're in one of our treatment groups, the intensity of physical activity associated with the improvement in attentional focus, all right? So this is looking at time on task post where we see this happening. But the level of activity in the control condition is associated with a reduction in time on task. And how do we understand that? What we think is happening is if you're in a situation right now, the one that you're in, where you're expected to be quiet, to sit, to pay attention, which is what most of these classes are done, and instead of doing that, you're moving around, right? You probably have some sort of attention issue or some sort of attention challenge, and so we think the physical activity we're picking up in the control condition is reflective of an attentional challenge, and that's why it's associated with that reduction in control but associated with an improvement in our other group. Okay. Does it matter what you teach? Or is it physical activity? So if we're doing these physically active lessons, does it matter what content you have, or is that the benefit? Or is it just that you're physically active that provides the benefit? So what we did was we had sedentary schools, and then, so this was all assigned at the school level, we had 10 schools that just did math lessons. And then we had 10 schools that just did spelling lessons, and they were all active. If all of them improve in math, then it's about physical activity. If all of them improve in spelling, then it's about physical activity. If only the spelling schools get better at spelling, then it's the combination that's important. If only the math schools get better at math, then it's the combination that's important. Does that make sense, the logic of sort of that design and what we did? Okay. So for spelling, we don't get anything. Math versus control, spelling versus control, we get a very, very small effect, non-significant. And this is what we look at with math fluency and math calculations. Math versus control, we get a significant effect. Spelling versus control, we do not. Math versus spelling, it's significant, but not a huge difference. But it's really only the math groups that are benefiting in math fluency, and math is better than spelling with math calculations. One of the things we didn't do was control when teachers implemented this, and some of them implemented in the morning, and some of them just did a crappy job implementing. If you take the teachers that implemented it during math and did it consistently, that effect is about half a standard deviation greater in those schools than in those other schools. So this becomes something that we're interested in. But what this suggests to us is that the combination is important, right? How much am I over now?
Give him the red card.
Okay, I'm almost done. So impact is limited to paired math content with physical activity. That's important because it means you can't just do more physical activity. Breaks aren't sufficient. It's the content that you're using with this that seems to be important, that seems to be having a larger effect. And then the other thing is that because that's in class, and because we get okay implementation from some teachers, we have to think a lot about how do we motivate those teachers to be able to move this forward, and how do we get to the point where you feel as though you're a bad teacher if you don't use physical activity as a part of this, right? That's the shift that has to be made, and policy isn't going to change it. We have to change how teachers think about their profession, just like we did when we got teachers to read true literature as opposed to using, a reader, and doing math problems instead of just practicing on work pages. So that type of change to be able to make this a best practice in school. Thank you to everybody who helped. And that's the University of Texas if you ever want to come visit.